Hi all, Adi here from Jaunts and Jaunts. As always, thank you so much for clicking on the video. I'm in deepest, darkest Wales and I'm at a place called Ruthin Gaol. I'm not precisely sure how you pronounce it, so apologies if I've got it completely wrong. Now, this place used to be a prison and it has a very dark past, and it's also supposed to be home to many ghosts. So let's go and have an explore. If you've ever wandered around this town of Ruthin in North Wales, there's a good chance you could have walked straight past one of the darkest buildings in the county without even realising it, because tucked away amongst the shops and houses is Ruthin Gaol, and at first glance it really doesn't stand out. It's an impressive old stone building, but nothing about it immediately tells you how much misery these walls have witnessed over the last couple of 100 years. Today it's a museum, and it's a very interesting one at that, but long before us tourists wandered through these corridors with our cameras and guidebooks, the people walking through those doors were doing so in chains. Now, some would have stolen food to survive, others were violent criminals. Others simply found themselves on the wrong side of a justice system that was incredibly harsh. Now, I know a lot of old prisons will tell similar stories, but Ruthin has a history that's very much its own. In fact, there's been some kind of prison on this site since 1654, when a house of correction known as Bridewell was built here. And back then, these places weren't just for hardened criminals. They were designed to deal with what society considered to be the undesirables of the day. So that would have included beggars, vagrants, drunkards, and petty thieves. Pretty much anyone who didn't quite fit into respectable society could have ended up behind these walls. By the middle of the 18th century, prisons across Britain were in a really shocking state. Disease spread easily, corruption was everywhere, and conditions were so bad that sometimes it was safer to go straight to trial than it was to sit in prison waiting to find out your fate. So along came a man called John Howard, and he changed everything. He wasn't a politician or a police officer, he was a prison reformer, and after visiting prisons all over Britain, he published a report exposing just how dreadful they really were, and his work embarrassed local authorities across the country, including those here in North Wales. Rather than ignore the criticism, the magistrates decided to act, and in 1775 they demolished the old Bridewell and built what they hoped would be a modern prison. It was considered something of a model jail for its time because it was cleaner, more organised, and supposedly more humane than what had come before it. Of course, by today's standards, humane is probably not the word that most of us would choose to use. But as prison reform continued during the Victorian period, attitudes towards punishment changed again. The government wanted prisons to become places of strict discipline and order, so in the 1860s, Ruthin underwent yet another huge transformation, and the building visitors explore today is largely the result of that Victorian rebuild. It was designed around ideas that had been used at Pentonville Prison in London, and that's why when we walk inside everything feels so symmetrical. Long corridors, rows of identical cells, iron staircases climbing through the middle of the building. It almost feels military, and that's exactly how it was intended, because every part of the building was designed to remind prisoner about who was ultimately in control. One thing that I noticed straight away about this place is that it feels quite compact, because most prisons are enormous, like small towns within themselves, but Ruthin isn't. It's surprisingly enclosed, and you're never very far from another locked door, another narrow corridor, or another tiny cell, and somehow that makes it feel even more oppressive. So it's easy for me to imagine the sound of heavy boots echoing through the corridors, the clatter of keys against iron doors, and the silence that would have followed every prisoner once they'd been locked away for the night. Life here wasn't designed to help people rebuild their lives, it was designed to punish them. The prison served the local area, holding men and women separately. Now, some of those inmates had committed violent crimes, but many were here for offences that seem almost unbelievable today. For instance, some had just stolen some food, poached rabbits or games, stealing livestock. Minor assaults or failing to pay debts could all land somebody behind bars. Now, it's easy for us to judge people from the comfort of our lives today, but Victorian Britain could be brutally unforgiving. There was no welfare system to fall back on, and if you lost your job or became ill, you would have starved very, very quickly. So for some people, stealing food wasn't about greed, it was about basic survival. Now, once prisoners arrived here, their lives became strictly controlled. They would have been searched, issued prison clothes, and locked into those tiny cells that offered very little comfort. And when I was standing inside one, it really put things into perspective. They were cramped, I imagine they were incredibly cold and basic. A simple bed, a stool, maybe they had a few personal items if they were lucky, but I can't imagine they had much else. And those thick stone walls must have kept the rooms cold for much of the year. And although daylight filtered through the windows, they were positioned so prisoners couldn't simply stare out at the world they had left behind. Their daily routine rarely changed. Prisoners were woken early, given basic meals of bread, porridge or soup, and then sent to work. And one of the most common jobs was picking oakum, and that involved pulling apart old tar-covered ropes by hand so the fibres could be reused. It was really dirty, repetitive work, and it would have left their fingers sore and raw. But it wasn't meant to teach them useful skills, it was meant to teach them obedience. Perhaps even harder than the physical work was the silence, because Victorian prisons often followed what was known as the separate systems, and this is where prisoners were discouraged from talking to each other, because they used to believe that conversations would only spread bad influences between the prisoners. So can you imagine spending days or even weeks surrounded by other people but never being allowed to have a proper conversation? That kind of isolation must have been mentally exhausting, especially if you're like me and I'm a chatterbox, so that would have been absolutely dreadful, being amongst so many people but not being able to communicate with them. One prisoner, though, had absolutely no intention of quietly accepting life behind bars. Now, his name was John Jaunts, although almost everyone knew him by his nickname, which was the little red-haired man from Bala, and he became one of the most notorious criminals in North Wales, not because he committed particularly horrific crimes, but because he seemed almost impossible to be kept locked up. Because while serving a sentence here at the prison, he somehow managed to tunnel his way out of the prison, and he used little more than determination and whatever tools he could get his hands on. Now, he escaped and fled into the Welsh countryside, but to make things even more impressive, he'd fashioned a rope from his prison bedding to help him get away. His freedom didn't last forever, because after a week on the run, police tracked him down, But, of course, rather than surrender peacefully, he reportedly exchanged gunfire with officers before eventually being recaptured. So if you think prison security was poor after hearing that, you're not alone. His escape became legendary across North Wales and remains one of the jail's most famous stories. But unfortunately, not everyone was fortunate to leave the prison alive. I loved this room and the records and the photographs they have from where it was turned into a munitions factory in the Second World War. And I'm looking at the photos of these ladies. I wonder what sort of lives they had. And I wonder if there's any family members in the area. Lovely to have those photographs. So. This crime detection cell was my favourite display in the museum. So you got some amazing photographs of some of the former inmates, and a couple of them there have their arms crossed on the chest. Does anyone know the reason behind that? If you do know why they were doing that, please do let me know in the comments, because I would have thought if it was a practice everyone would have been doing it, but they seem to be the only two in the photographs. So this is great, this display with the photograph of the person, their age, their offence and the sentence that they got. So Benjamin was 40. He looks like a little boy, doesn't he? Bless him. Oh, he's only 18. Housebreaking, 6 months hard labour. But a fantastic display. Really enjoyed that. The prison's most infamous inmate was William Hughes. Now, he was convicted of unaliving his wife in 1903, and during his trial his defence argued that he was insane, but the jury wasn't convinced, and Hughes was sentenced to and became the last person to be executed at Ruthin Gaol. Now, unlike the public hangings of earlier centuries, his execution took place inside the prison walls, away from the crowds, and somewhere within this building, in this cell, he would have spent his final hours. Now, knowing exactly what awaited him the following morning, it's difficult to imagine the fear he must have felt. And whether people think he deserved his fate or not, those final moments must have been unimaginably bleak for him. Just over a decade later, the jail's role as a prison came to an end. It actually closed in 1916, and over the years the building has found a variety of new uses. It became council offices. It later housed the county library service and was even used to manufacture munitions during the Second World War. But thankfully, instead of being demolished like so many historic prisons have, it was preserved and eventually was opened as the museum, which we're very lucky that we can explore today. But of course, for many people, it's not just the history that draws them here. It's the stories of the unexplained. The jail has earned a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in North Wales. Now, both staff and visitors have reported hearing footsteps echoing through empty corridors and doors closing by themselves, strange voices when no one else is around. Some people have described sudden cold spots that seem to appear for no obvious reason, while others say they felt as though someone was standing right behind them, only to turn around and find the corridor completely empty. Now, the condemned cell where we just were seems to feature in a lot of these stories. Visitors have reported feeling unusually emotional while standing inside there, and a few have even refused to stay there for very long because the atmosphere simply felt wrong. So, me personally, I think that's more to do with the power of suggestion, because, you know, you've got that bit of empathy thinking about how that poor man must have felt knowing the fate that awaited him. And the building around here can, you know, make you feel quite unsettled, and I'm sure there's loads of things that can't easily be explained, but I will leave that completely up to you. I mean, personally, I think the real reason it feels so unsettling, it's got less to do with the ghosts and probably more to do with its bleak history. When you know the stories of these people who are imprisoned here, the families torn apart by poverty, the desperate men feeling that they had no other option but to steal food to feed their family. It's really sad, isn't it? Of course, there's the notorious escape artist and the condemned prisoner awaiting his execution, but it becomes impossible not to imagine those lives lingering in some way. And I do feel that history always leaves an impression on places, and few places wear their history quite as heavily as this jail. So if you ever find yourself in Wales, I recommend you pay a visit here. Whether you're interested in history, true crime, architecture or the paranormal, there's really something here that will capture your imagination. And who knows, as you walk through these corridors, you might even experience something you can't quite explain. Or perhaps the only thing haunting this jail is the memory of the people whose lives were changed forever behind these stone walls. Either way, it's a place that will stay with me long after I have left through the gates. I thought this was really fascinating how they had 6 different classes of prisoner, and depending on what class they were, it depended on what they got fed. I mean, imagine doing hard labour and that's what you're getting fed. A pound of grill, pound of potatoes and a pound of grill. It must have just added to their misery. I'm going to wrap the video up here. I really do hope you enjoyed it. It was very interesting, wasn't it? And if you did enjoy it, if you could please like, subscribe, hit the hype button down below. It doesn't cost you anything, but it really helps the channel out. So I shall see you for the next one. Bye for now.